The Pentagon has released a report outlining a range of scenarios that China could use to take over Taiwan. The report says a maritime blockade is the most likely. U.S. defense officials say an invasion or attack is not imminent, but China has been ramping up military activity around the country. Last year, China conducted a record 20 naval exercises simulating the capture of Taiwan. For more on possible conflict scenarios, our reporter Jaime Ocon spoke to Mark Cancian, Senior Advisor and War Games Specialist at the Center of Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C.
In this report released by the Department of Defense, there is an outline of the most likely scenarios China could take using force to capture Taiwan, and the most likely is an air or a maritime blockade. Can you tell us why?
The consensus in Washington is that a blockade would be less risky for China. It would not involve immediate direct confrontation with U.S. military forces, but on the other hand would put Taiwan under a lot of pressure, economic, political, to conform to the Chinese Communist Party's wishes. It's not the most dangerous. Of course, the most dangerous would be an actual invasion, and that can't be ruled out, but blockade would be the most likely. Now, a blockade might also escalate to a intense conflict. If the United States, for example, tried to push convoys through the blockade into Taiwan, which I think would be highly likely, then the Chinese would have to attack U.S. ships to stop those convoys, and that might escalate to more general conflict.
One of the last options outlined in this report is a full-scale invasion. Can you talk a little bit about why this would be so difficult to accomplish?
Well, a full-scale invasion would, of course, be the most dangerous, and China has threatened that. It's very difficult for two reasons. The first is that Taiwan is an island, and it requires crossing a body of water. It's not a very large body of water, but it still requires shipping and offloading, which are very complicated operations. It took the United States years to develop the techniques to do that in the Second World War. It's not like Russia crossing a land border into Ukraine and being able to supply directly. The second thing is that Taiwan is a very easy island to defend. There's a rugged set of mountains in the center. The two coastal plains are intersected by cities and rivers, and the Taiwanese military forces could put up substantial resistance and really hold the Chinese invading forces back.
In your experiences and wargaming simulations, are you seeing other countries, aside from the US, China, and Taiwan, getting involved in a broader conflict?
Developed a war game to examine how that conflict might unfold. For that war game, we had to develop a base case, that is the case that we thought was the most likely, and then we ran some excursions to see how changes might affect the outcome. The base case, we assumed, of course, the U.S. and Taiwan would be involved. We assumed that the United States would be involved from the very beginning. We also assumed that Japan would become involved if the Chinese attacked Japanese territory. But we also assumed that the United States would be able to use its military bases in Japan, particularly Kadena, for example, but also Misawa and some of the other ones on the Japanese main islands. What happened in the war game is that China almost always attacked Japan because of these U.S. military bases and the fact the U.S. was using them for operations against Chinese forces. So Japan almost always came into the conflict.